Hey everyone, we are just going to do a quick little video about the Cold War to make sure you guys have the basics as we go into class tomorrow and we talk about proxy wars. So first of all, the Cold War is really said to be between 1947 and 1991. To look for a definition that you want to get down in your notes is an economic and political ideological rivalry and tension between the United States and the Soviet Union where there was no direct engagement in warfare. So you want to write that down to make sure you have kind of the definition of what the Cold War is, and we'll get into kind of a lot of dynamics that have to deal with this. So make sure you have that down as a definition of the Cold War. A few of the causes is there's four major ones. One is competing ideologies. So we have this difference in kind of economics of capitalism versus socialism. Capitalism, as we know, is like the free market, and socialism being kind of the economic makeup where the government is controlling the economy in that way with collectivization a lot of times, along with kind of state-controlled businesses. And then we also have the competing ideologies of democracy versus communism as well. And so that's more in the political realm compared to the economic realm. Also, there's going to be some resentment between the two superpowers we see after World War II. We see that the United States did step in and tried to stop the Russian Revolution, which did not make the Russians and ultimately the Soviets very happy. Also, we know that during the beginning of World War II, the Soviets stepped in and signed that non-aggression pact with Germany, which made us very angry as well. So we see some of the resentment between the two parties as the United States is kind of meddling in their business, and how the Soviets then got involved with the Germans. Also, obviously, the atomic bomb, and that the United States had it at this time, and initially the Soviets did not. And then also the big conflict initially is going to be how Germany was divided, and we have the four different zones in the division of Berlin, which we'll look at in a second. I'm going to show you a quick video within a video, of a Cold War overview, and you're going to see these different terms on the right side of the screen that you want to kind of get down. So Iron Curtain, Spheres of Influence, Truman Doctrine, Marshall Plan, Warsaw Pact, Berlin Blockade, Red Scare, and the Arms Race. And some of these are going to go over in the next slides after this, but this will give you kind of an intro to this. And I'll fast forward just a little bit so you guys have some opening questions here that you don't necessarily need to answer, but the video will go into those terms. And so here you go.
Cold War. It's the term to describe the battle between the United States and the USSR from 1945 to 1991. It was an ideological battle between the liberal and anti-liberal societies. It's cold because they never actually fought each other. That would be called a hot war. Winston Churchill coined the term Iron Curtain to describe the fact that these two nation-states refused to cooperate or openly communicate with each other, as if a metal wall separated them. Near the end of World War II, the alliance between the Americans and Soviets that was created to defeat the Nazi threat was dissolving. At the Yalta and Potsdam conferences at the end of the war, disagreements broke out over what to do with the defeated Germany. One issue was the creation of spheres of influence. When the Americans helped to liberate Italy, they took control of the government. So that led the Soviet Union to believe that all of the Eastern European countries they had liberated should be under their control. The Soviets wanted to ensure that they had a sphere of influence over Eastern Europe to create a buffer zone between themselves and Western Europe, specifically Germany, who had waged two major wars in less than 40 years. The Soviets had lost up to 30 million people in World War II alone. The Americans feared the idea of the spread of communism, so they rejected that idea of Soviet control of Germany. Instead, the decision was made to split Germany into four pieces, with the capital city of Berlin also divided into four pieces. The Soviets were not impressed with this because Berlin was in their quarter, but we're going to talk about that conflict in the next lesson. So as World War II ends, we have two superpowers who create their own spheres of influence, making the world bipolar. Literally. The Soviets controlled Eastern Europe and established communist dictatorships. Western Europe was in the American sphere of influence, and they encouraged liberal societies, capitalist democracies. The Americans knew they couldn't wage a war to prevent the spread of communism in Europe, so they set up a plan to contain communism. It was known as the Truman Doctrine, and part of that plan included the use of financial rebuilding through the Marshall Plan. By spending millions of dollars to rebuild war-torn countries, those nation-states would become stable, and stable democratic countries don't embrace radical ideas like communism. Of course, the Soviets refused to allow the Eastern European countries to take advantage of the Marshall Plan funds because they didn't want to lose their sphere of influence, so they set up their own called ComCon. Militarily, the Soviets had more soldiers, but the Americans had nuclear bombs. Eventually, the Soviets get their own nuclear arsenal, but we'll talk about that in a lesson on deterrence and brinkmanship. The Americans still worried that Stalin wanted to become the next Hitler to try and take over the world, especially after Stalin tried to get control over Berlin. So they allied with other nations to create NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, which was an alliance that stated if any member state was attacked, all member nations would protect them. That way, if Stalin tried to take on moves like Hitler did, invading places like Czechoslovakia, the Soviets would think twice because there would be a serious military force ready to stop them. Later, Stalin created the Warsaw Pact as a counter to NATO's power. So it's the end of the 1940s, and both sides are ramping up the rhetoric, telling the people that the evil empire on the other side of the ocean wants to destroy their superior society, whether it be the Soviet communist utopia or the American capitalist dream. There are several events during the Cold War that could have erupted into all-out war. The Berlin blockade, the Czechoslovakian communist coup, the creation of NATO and the Warsaw Pact, the Korean War, a Hungarian uprising, the building of the Berlin Wall, the Cuban Missile Crisis, the Vietnam War, the Czechoslovakia Prague Spring, the invasion of Afghanistan, even the war between Iran and Iraq. Thank heavens the balance of power between these two nation-states kept these events from becoming World War III. One last thing I want to talk about today is the social implication of the Cold War on American and Canadian society. The baby boomers, that demographic bulge of people added to our population after the war, well, their lives began just as the Cold War began. The actions of the conflicting superpowers influenced their outlook on the world, and they questioned whether the actions of the government really were in the best interest of the people. Like the philosophers during the Enlightenment centuries earlier, these young people questioned why society was organized the way it was and fought back. They were referred to as the counterculture. That's the hippie movement with their anti-war protests, the peaceniks, the civil rights movement, and the increasing number of feminists who demanded equal rights for women. This questioning of authority concerned many of the adults who were conservative in their views of society. They felt that during this time of heightened fear and security, we should trust our authority figures. The fear wasn't all hype. Soviet spies were found in both Canada and the United States. The Rosenbergs were a couple discovered in the US who were stealing nuclear technology secrets to help the Soviets with their nuclear program. But some government officials took advantage of the fear, the Red Scare. Most famous are the congressional hearings led by Senator Joseph McCarthy, who had people interrogated and blacklisted as supporters of communism. It became a witch hunt as people were labeled as communists by their political enemies as a way to get revenge. People who fought for women's rights or improved child labor laws were labeled as communist sympathizers. Many actors in Hollywood were suspected and charged. Once you were blacklisted, it was difficult to ever get a good job again, and you were discriminated against by members of your community. Most of the convictions were later overturned as it was found that the court procedures hadn't been followed and people's rights had been violated. That was a very illiberal event in U.S. history. This era also led to an unprecedented military buildup. When Eisenhower became president, he warned the nation of what he labeled the military-industrial complex. In other words, there was such an emphasis on military buildup when the nation wasn't even at war that it created a massive industry that employed thousands of people. He worried that lobbyists from these industries would convince the government to hype up any suspected threat in order to garner public support for increased spending on military supplies. This warning went somewhat unheeded, and even today there are concerns with the level of influence private military manufacturing businesses have over government. In our next video, we're going to look at the time and money that was spent to prevent the spread of communism, also known as containment.
Perfect. So hopefully that gives some of those terms. So we just wanted to kind of look here. First of all, the Iron Curtain being that invisible line, they talked about this, that separates the Soviet and U.S. spheres of influence. And so there's kind of this invisible line that goes all the way through Germany, what used to be West and East Germany, and then down ultimately to the Adriatic Sea. And so we see kind of on the eastern side, we have those in the Soviet sphere of influence, and then those in the West with the U.S. sphere of influence. Winston Churchill gave a famous speech that you're not going to hear. And so you can look at that if you want. This will be posted. The Truman Doctrine, then, as the video said, just to review, is that the U.S. would support countries economically and militarily to prevent them from falling into the Soviet sphere of influence. And so this is kind of, as you can see the picture here, how we gave assistance to Greece and Turkey, which goes into the Marshall Plan, which was the actual economic plan to help rebuild Europe after World War II, and it focused on those two countries. The Berlin Wall was also kind of a unique situation. So, as we talked about before, Berlin was originally divided into 4 different kind of sectors, and ultimately it joined to both an east and a west. So, all Western countries under kind of the U.S. sphere of influence combined together to make West Berlin, and then there was East Berlin. And a wall was built around basically so that people could not leave East Berlin and enter West Berlin. So you can see the wall that was kind of around the entirety of West Berlin to keep people, because remember, this is all within East Germany, so that East Germans could not enter West Berlin, which was under the U.S. Control. And so as you guys can kind of see here, a giant wall with, you can see the different checkpoints in here, which are pretty major. One of the major ones being checkpoint Charlie, if you've ever heard of that term before. I'll show you a picture of that. This is the Brandenburg Gate, and you see kind of how it's very much divided. Reagan will give a very famous speech here, and then how fast the wall kind of went up. So you can go on this link also if you're interested a little bit more about how they made the Berlin Wall. And then there's some just different stories that you can kind of go to. I'll open this up real quick, of just some of the crazy stories that we will see about the Berlin Wall, where people could not leave and enter into West Berlin. And so people would try, and this is just a story of someone who was shot, and we can kind of show you about this death strip that happened. And so people tried to escape, and many were killed. And then there are places where they tried to tunnel out of East Germany to make it into West Berlin. And so just different stories. And this one we had a story of someone who was accidentally pushed into the water, and then no attempt was made by East German officials to rescue the child. And so we see of like this big border control as you look at this. This is just a funny story if you want to see about the rabbits between the 2 spaces. But there's a lot of different stories of people that tried to escape and get back to families, because a lot of times the wall went up so fast they weren't able to kind of see family before the wall was there. So just as we are looking at these stories, you can look at them some more if you would like. And then just a few pictures from the containment first. So containment is a definition you want to make sure you have. The domino theory is basically that if one state in a region comes under the influence of communism, then the surrounding countries will fall to it too. And so the U.S. had a policy of containment where they needed to contain communism and prevent the spread. So this domino theory and containment definitions are highly important for you to know. Just a few pictures today of the Berlin Wall, just so you see how big it is. There's not a lot of it left. But there I am, and you can see how tall it was around the entirety of West Berlin. And so you see a lot of the graffiti that is on it today. Brandenburg Gate paintings here. This is the Brandenburg Gate today without the wall separating it. And many people would use these to kind of escape. I can tell you more stories sometime. But this is Checkpoint Charlie, which was, as you can see up here, you're entering the American sector. Carrying weapons is duly permitted. And so you see this, and now we see a modern McDonald's. But we can talk more about this, but we want you to see and get these basics of the Cold War, of some of the policies in terms of why people were doing the things they did, as we see these 2 great rivalries and superpowers that became the Cold War. And a lot of times, while they didn't fight each other, there were proxy wars and hot wars, as your book talks about, and we'll talk about that in class tomorrow. So hopefully this is a good intro.